Hello, today on V70 Yes, we are at 322,000 miles and we're going to be replacing the oil pump, the crank seal and the cam seal. So as you can see, I've already jacked up the car and removed the driver's side front wheel. The parts are all genuine Volvo. Now originally I was only changing the crank and the cam seal, and the reason I'm doing the oil pump now is because on startup recently the oil pressure light has not been going out for a good 4 seconds, and in all honesty with this mileage the thought of the oil pump failing has been on my mind. So there may be other reasons for the oil pressure to be not reaching the correct pressure quickly, but rather than risk it, I'll change the oil pump and then change anything else that may be causing the oil pressure not to go up quickly. So I'll just show you now see the oil light at this side, starting the car from completely cold. Good 3 to 4 seconds for the oil pressure light to go out. So it's a good excuse while I'll have the timing belt off anyway to do the cam and the crank seals to get the oil pump done as well. And the parts that you can see here have totaled £271.50, including the VAT, and the cam and the crank seal were around £30 all in, directly from Volvo. Although on the pump, so this is the new pump, it does appear, as is common with parts supply from manufacturers, they have told me that I would need to buy the seal separately and also this O-ring separately, and it appears that they are already attached to the new oil pump, so we could have saved ourselves another 20 quid off there. So let's say that the parts all in here are going to come up to about £300. So we're going to get on with the job. So first thing we need to do is have the car jacked up and securely on an axle stand as high as we can get it, and then we need to remove the wheel arch liner. Now mine doesn't have all of the fixings attached like yours may do, and it may even be riveted, so you may need to drill out some rivets, but there should be some fixings here, and you would have 10mm plastic nuts like that one there holding the wheel arch liner to the body. But what you'll want to do is pull the wheel arch liner as far out of position as you can, giving us as much space to get to the crank pulley as possible. So we need to remove the auxiliary belt, but while we're here we might as well remove the engine cover. If you want a bit more room, then you can remove the ECU box. And as we'll be working on the timing belt, you may want to move the power steering fluid reservoir. If you stick a screwdriver in the back of the clip that you can just see under my finger, so not on the expansion tank side, in between the reservoir and the clip, so pushing it that way, you can easily unclip the reservoir and just push it to the other side out of the way. With a T60 Torx, you need to remove the auxiliary belt by loosening the tensioner. It'll help if you've got a bar or a longer ratchet than this, as they are quite tight to loosen. So you're just pulling it so at the same time as releasing the tension on the belt, you can just pull it off anywhere. Just pulled it off the power steering pump. And also, if you can get a drill bit or a pin that will fit in the hole, you can lock the tensioner in the loose position. Take a picture or make note of the route that the auxiliary belt takes, because you'd be surprised how easy it is to get confused putting it back on. So I'm just pulling the auxiliary belt fully off. Remove the 10mm bolt from the timing belt cover, and then you'll be able to unclip it and remove it completely. So before we put the engine in top dead centre, we need to get this crank pulley, or this part of the crank pulley is actually the harmonic dampener, and this nut here, the crank pulley main nut, is tightened to 300 Newton meters, so we'll require more than that to remove, which in the past I've done with a long torque wrench. I'm going to try it with a battery powered windy gun, as this will mean that I won't have to put the locking tool on the crank pulley, and the alternative as well would be to get someone to put the car in a high gear, 4th, 5th, 6th, and stand on the brakes to lock the crank in position. However, this does put strain on the timing belt. I don't think it's something that would damage it, but it's an option if you need it. I'm going to try with this windy gun here. It's a lot bigger than any that I've tried before. Now this isn't an impact socket, so it's up to you whether you do this or not, but you should really use impact sockets on impact tools. This is a 1" and 3/16 socket, but I think in metric this is 30mm, but I'm not 100% on that. Wow, that's a lot easier than I've ever had it in the past. I've had to do that manually with a breaker bar, so that's very good. So now we just need to remove the 4 bolts around the crank pulley dampener. So we've got 13mm bolts around the outside. Now something that you might have to do to get to the 4th bolt is turn the engine over. And to do this, you might want to use the crank nut. So you'll have to tighten it back up again. You won't have to torque it, but we just need to be able to use it to turn the engine over. So you can use the socket on a breaker bar. Until you've got enough room to access the 4th bolt. So that's the harmonic dampener removed. We've got the crankshaft pulley behind that. And what we'll need to do first is put the engine at top dead centre. So we'll need to time it up so we know that the crank and the cam are both at top dead centre. So we need to put the nut back on, because this is the only way that we've got of turning the engine over, unless we use the screwdriver on the camshaft sprocket. But this is the most reliable and easiest way to do it, with a breaker bar on the crank pulley. In order to time the engine up, we've got a mark on the camshaft, so not that white mark, the little indentation just above it, and we need to line that up with this mark here on the timing belt cover. And for the crank, we need to line up that ridge there. There's only one ridge, one side with a ridge on like that, and we need to line that up with the end of that there. So that bit that sticks down, I'll try and get another angle. So we're lining it up with that part on the left. So as you can see, we've nearly got the crank pulley lined up, but the cam pulley is at the complete opposite end of where we need it to be, and that's because the camshaft spins at half the speed that the crankshaft does. So we need to go around a full revolution again in order to get both marks timed up. So there we go, we've got the cam sprocket timed up and we've got the crank sprocket timed up. So now we're ready to remove the timing belt and the crank pulley. There's also this lower cover here that you can remove easily. So we've just got 10mm, two 10mm bolts holding this lower cover in position. So I'm going to remove that as well. Undo the tensioner bolt, just loosening it. Using a 6mm hex, you need to move the tensioner position from the 2 PM position to the 10 AM position, which slackens it off completely. You can now remove the timing belt at any point that is slack enough. And if you're still struggling, what you can do is you can pull here, which will slacken the belt even more. So this belt I only changed 20k ago, so I am going to reuse it. So I want to make sure that I don't get grease all over it and keep it clean. Next step is pulling the crankshaft pulley off the splined end of the crankshaft. Now, I'm having some trouble with this because the only puller I've got is big enough to pull the moon out of orbit, but way too big to get this crankshaft pulley off. So I'm having to try a few techniques. You can't pry it off because you'll do damage. You need to find a way to pull it straight off if possible. And as I'm working on a Saturday evening, I haven't got the option to go to the shop and buy something, and I am struggling to find a strong enough piece of metal to go across these two holes and press against the crankshaft. So I'm trying with a spanner against the end of the crankshaft and against the body, which I think I've had it move a little bit, but I'm just going to try again. Another thing that I would have done, if I could have found some long enough bolts that fit through the harmonic dampener, I would have covered this hole with a strong piece of metal and put 2 longer bolts through and just tightened these bolts up until it pulled the crankshaft pulley off the spline. But the thread appears to be an odd thread, so I'm struggling to find a long bolt as well. So this is what I tried before. It is coming. So not fully off, that is progress. So slightly longer spanner. we go. Look at that. So as you can see, you can't refit this in the wrong position. The spline has a tooth missing, which lines up with the crankshaft. So we're not going to lose the timing, even if the crank does somehow manage to turn while this is removed. But I'm chuffed with that. I've been struggling with that for a good hour, trying to figure out how to get it off without a correct size puller. So yeah. So you might notice as I go along that the engine is getting a little bit cleaner, and this is one of the things that I have been excited about doing this job for, is to get all this grime away from the engine and stop the leaks so that they don't occur anymore. And as you can see, I'm probably going to have to remove the water pump because I think it's seeping coolant, as well as the crank seal and the cam seal leaking oil. So I will be cleaning that as the job goes along. But now we're in a position to undo the oil pump. So I do apologise for the confusion regarding these parts, because I've asked for particular parts from Volvo and it looks like they've actually given me slightly different ones to the ones that I thought I was getting. So it looks like this is actually the rear crank seal. This is the seal for the gearbox side of the crank. This is the camshaft seal, and this is the front crank seal, which you can also see here has come with the oil pump. So I didn't need a second one. And it turns out there really doesn't appear to be any issue with this crank seal, but it doesn't matter, it's still going to be coming out with the oil pump. Now, if you aren't replacing the oil pump, what you'll need to do now is drill a tiny hole in the seal and pull it out. So you don't actually need to remove the oil pump, you just need to drill a tiny hole in the seal and pull the old seal out. And to fit the new seal, you'll need like a large socket or something the same size as the new seal to push it evenly, even pressure around the new seal. And you may want to tape over the splines just to protect the end of the crankshaft. So on the oil pump, we've got 4 T30 Torx screws. Now these are the screws that you can get replacements for from Volvo. Obviously they suggest it, but as with other bolts, I've kept them the same. I'm not going to replace them. I'm sure they'll be fine. So undo the 4 T30 Torx screws. So we've got the bolts removed, and now we need to lever behind the lugs. A smaller screwdriver. found to be a little bit difficult to remove, as the engine has 322,000 miles on, and this will be the original oil pump. Hopefully it is taking a bit of moving backwards and forwards, but it does appear to be coming away. Yeah, that's coming away. There we go. So make sure you get the old gasket out as well. So there we have it, the original oil pump. I may open this up just to see if there is any wear, noticeable wear. Obviously I've got a new gasket, so I'm not worried about that. So do make sure that you clean around the edges before inserting the new one. I'm going to drop the oil and change the filter for the new oil pump. And I bet there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. Taking the cover off, and this is the part that does the pumping. Before we put the new pump into position, I'm going to give this a wipe down, make sure there's no debris sat anywhere, and also you'll see that I've taped over the splined part of the crankshaft, and this is to protect the new crank seal, so we don't want to damage it while putting it back on. So we've got the new gasket to fit, so what I'm thinking is I'm going to stick it to the oil pump rather than the block. I want to make sure that it goes in the exactly correct position, so we've got it with this opening here and all the bolt holes lined up. So what I'm planning to do is stick it down with a tiny amount of gasket maker, just to make sure that it stays in position while we're fitting it. So I've just smeared some on really thin, and I'm going to put the new gasket in position. And hopefully that'll be enough to keep it still while refitting. My gasket's where I wanted it. I've smeared some clean oil all around the O-ring and a little bit on the inside of the crank seal. Now we can see from the timing mark that this is the correct orientation of the oil pump. So I'm going to gently push the oil pump over the crankshaft. And what I'm going to do to make sure that the gasket doesn't move is stick the bolts in position before pushing it to the back. I'll just check it. So yeah, I'll keep those two bolts pushed through. Carefully position it over the crankshaft. And with all these bolts back in the holes, if I gently tighten them up a little bit at a time, I'll be able to evenly pull the oil pump towards the block. Now the torque setting for these bolts is only 6 Newton meters, so literally finger tight with this short ratchet. Nothing more is required. So on mine, the spring that's supposed to be on the inside of the seal has managed to get knocked off. So I'm having to remove the oil pump and try again. So suppose, it's fortunate I have got a spare seal, but this is not going to be easy to remove again. And I'll be worried about the gasket this time. So hopefully, I'm hoping the gasket doesn't get damaged in pulling this back off. I don't have much choice unless I pulled the seal out and swapped it for the other one. So the gasket's alright, but I'm pretty sure I won't be able to get that spring back in the rear of that seal. I might have a try, but it's looking like I might have to use the spare seal. So I have actually managed to get it back into position behind this lip. Did it by pushing the whole circumference down with 3 fingers at the same time, and it just sort of sprang back into position. I've no idea how it managed to find its way off, but I'm going to have another go at refitting, take extra care not to knock it off again. So second attempt, gasket's still in the correct position. Very, very careful over the crankshaft, as before. Somehow wasn't good enough. Make sure it's lined up before pushing it over the end. Let's see what's happening. So the seal is getting pushed out. So what I may need to do at the same time as pushing it in, I'm going to have to find a way to push on the seal. Otherwise my only option is going to be to remove the seal and fit the seal after the pump. Incorrectly this time. So I'm a little bit concerned now that I probably introduced a problem rather than curing it, because using the screwdriver very carefully to push the crank seal in may have introduced dirt, so I may find that in the future this seal ends up leaking, but I'll find out, and I have got a spare seal, so you might find a video in the future just changing the crank seal. We'll see how it goes. So I'm not sticking the crank pulley back on yet because I've got the cam seal to do now, and once I've got the cam sprocket off, I want to take off this plastic cover and give the side of the engine a really good clean. And I'll be so happy once there's no more leaks and the engine actually stays clean underneath. So you need to find something to hold the cam sprocket in position while undoing these bolts. So what I'm going to do, I think, if I can make enough room, is I might try using the windy gun so that the cam sprocket doesn't turn. So I've lifted the coolant expansion tank out of the way, and it has just about given me enough room to get this windy gun in position. But I don't know if I'll be able to get the bottom bolts as well. We'll try, let's just see if this moves the, we can do it without moving the cam sprocket. Turning. So we need to try and find a way to do this without the cam sprocket turning, because we don't want to end up in a position where the engine's out of time. Although, just a thought, what I can do is, as we're not removing the sprocket straight away, if I can just manage to get the bolts loose and then move the cam sprocket back into position, we should be alright. So I've just managed to get that one to come loose. So just really quickly, right. So we've knocked it out of time a little bit, but I can move the cam sprocket back into the correct position before removing the sprocket. So we've got the timing mark back in position, although as you can see, we're timing against the back cover for the timing belt, and mine has worn itself away so much that it could be any of those positions. But if we go somewhere near the centre, that appears to be correct. And now all the cam bolts are loose. So prior to this, I didn't actually realise that we need to remove the vacuum pump in order to lock the cam at the other end. So this involves removing the airbox, which is just sat on lugs that you can lift up and pull off, and you'll need to disconnect the MAF sensor and pull the MAF away from this pipe, which would be sat here. The only reason I've got it off is because I'm just checking the turbo to see if it's still suitable for leaving on the car. And then we need to disconnect the battery because we need to pull this fuse box out of the way. And to do that, we need to disconnect these positive electrical leads. So we're going to disconnect the battery in the boot. I'm going to have to do it by crawling inside the car because I've got the car backed up to the door and the car is obviously on axle stands. So here's the 6-speed gearbox in my boot, ready to be fitted. I need to get under the floor to disconnect the battery, so hopefully, times like this I'm glad that I don't put the plastic tray back in. So I'm just going to disconnect the negative lead. Got all this carpet in here for when I need to work on the something outside, and also for sound deadening for the noisy exhaust. So that negative lead disconnected. 13mm to remove the nut for these positive leads. 10mm bolt at the bottom of the fuse box. And then there's another 10mm at the bottom of this recess here. Probably never been removed before. We'll just pull in the fuse box out of the way the best we can. So I've removed the 10mm from this bracket here, and the only reason I've been able to get so much movement on this is because I've got the pipe off from the turbo, because I've been inspecting the turbo. But this is the vacuum pump that we need to remove, so just find a way to get enough access, or at least visibility. Take this pipe off the top, and hard to do with one hand. Oh. So we've got the vacuum pump here, and as you can see, I've removed the vacuum pipe coming off it, and I'm actually quite glad to take this off because it's absolutely filthy. I don't know what things like this are. Obviously there's a lot of dirt that I'll at least be able to get cleaned off. So there are 3 bolts holding the vacuum pump in position. Got one there, and the other 2 are lower down, so they're a bit difficult for me to show, but they're the same size. That's the vacuum pump removed, so I'm going to give this a good clean. So all I've done is given the cam sprocket a tiny tap with this small hammer, and it does appear to have loosened off to some degree. So the cam's not moving, by the way, it's just the sprocket, and there we go. So it's not splined like I thought it was. For some reason I thought it was splined, but yeah, that came off pretty easily. So now I'm going to remove this rear timing belt cover by removing the Torx screws up and down the block. To get this rear cover off, I've removed all the T30 Torx screws, but it looks like I've got to also remove the timing belt tensioner too. So remove the tensioner completely. For a moment there I thought there was another bolt, but it just hooks around the back of the coolant pump. It doesn't look like there's a whole lot of room to remove it, so it gets stuck on the coolant pump. So what I'm going to do is leave the cover sat there, because it still gives me enough room to clean up everything that I want to get cleaned up. I want to clean around the cam seal first, so that when we are removing it, there's no way that we're going to introduce any debris into the top of the engine and onto the new seal. So I'm ready to remove the cam seal. What I'm going to quickly do is check the size of the new one against the old one. So that's correct. Now, this is exactly what you would have needed to do had you been removing the crank seal and not the oil pump. You need to drill a small hole in the old seal. Now you'll need to take care not to damage the engine in doing this. So I'm just going to look for a position where I'm not going to slip. So I'm using a 1.5mm drill bit. Keeps slipping off. Strange. just slipping. I'm going to try a 2.5mm drill bit. Really do hope that I haven't damaged the metal where the seal will be sat on top of, but the drill just keeps slipping straight off. This is the new seal, and it's like this outer part is actually made of metal, and the drill bit just slips off and goes into the rubber part. Well, I really hope I didn't just damage something, but that's what it took to get a hole through it. So I've got a little hole drilled, and we're going to need to stick a self-tapping screw in there. And now what we need to try and do is pull the seal out of position, but I suspect that it's going to be pretty tough to remove because this will probably be the original cam seal, and this engine's done 320,000 miles. Oh, there we go, all at once. So don't chuck this away. Don't chuck this away. What I'm going to do is use this old seal to push the new seal into position, because I don't have a socket that's a good size for pushing the new one in. Doesn't actually look in bad condition, strangely, but it definitely was leaking. So clean the surface and make sure that there's no debris anywhere around the camshaft. As you can see, you can't push the camshaft any further than that lip, so you'll know when it's in position. Smear some oil on the inside of the new seal. Be careful when pushing the seal initially on there, not for the centre, the internal part of the seal to fold back over on itself and pop the spring out. So just watch it, and as you're pushing it on, make sure that you're pushing it on equally from the top and the bottom. And pushing on the outside, which is made of metal. So you should be able to see pretty clearly when the new seal is seated correctly. It's the distance from the tip, the distance from the side of the block, and the new seal will be the same all the way around. I'm ready to start putting everything back together, but something else that I wanted to address was the rear timing belt cover being so loose. So what I've done is I've taken the bolts back out and I've got myself some foam pads, sticky back foam pads, but they just need to be foam, that's all. I've drilled a hole in the middle of them, stuck the securing bolt through it and over the bit where it's supposed to hold the timing belt cover securely, and then I've cut round it to make myself basically a foam washer, which is holding the timing belt cover snugly, and it should be central, so it should allow the timing mark to be in the correct position. And obviously if the cover was rattling, this does address that, which I'm you know, if I can get rid of a rattle while I'm at it, I might as well. So I've done that for every bolt and bolted it back together. Now we're ready to get the cam sprocket refitted, and I bought myself a genuine Volvo cam locking tub, which appears to come with this shelving bracket of some sort, storage. Anyway, we need to stick that in the hole behind the vacuum pump, which we already removed. So if we're slightly off, then we will need to move the exhaust cam slightly to get the hole central. Doesn't look like we're far off. So I've just stuck 2 bolts back in the cam, which will give me enough. I'll be able to just turn the cam whichever way I want it, so I'll just wiggle it just so that I can get that tool pushed fully into the hole. So that's fully in now, locking the cam in position. We're refitting the cam sprocket, and as you can see, someone's put a white mark where the timing mark is, the little indentation there. You've also got an indentation on the back, which will make it a bit more obvious which way up it goes. Now, I'm going to aim to get the bolts in exactly the same position, because obviously we've got these elongated holes, but we can see exactly where the bolts sat before, which should mean it'll be in exactly the same time as it was before. Make sure the mating surfaces are clean and free of any debris. So we're lining up this mark here with this mark here. And it looks like we've got all the bolts in exactly the same place. So as we're reusing the sprocket, there shouldn't be any chance that we can get this wrong. The cover is now secure thanks to the foam washers that I've made. We can tighten these up now. They are only 30 Newton meters, and obviously the cam is locked in position, so we won't have any issue tightening these. Just watch that when you tighten the first one, that the sprocket doesn't move at all. So quick check after tightening, make sure that the timing marks are aligned. I'm happy with that. So I didn't need a crank locking tool because the crank hasn't been moved. There is a locating groove, so there's a spline missing on the crank pulley, so you can't fit this the wrong way around. And the crank pulley then lines up with the oil pump, which can't be fitted any other way. So using that mark there, the double spline here, which lines up with the crank pulley, is in the same position it was in when we started the job. So we just need to clean off these splines, get rid of all the debris. Refit the tensioner if you removed it like I did. Ready to refit the timing belt. I've given this a check over all the way around, although I only fitted this 22,000 miles ago, so it is in very good condition. If it isn't and you are due a change, then obviously change it. There is a more thorough video regarding the timing belt change and the tensioner on my channel. So I'm just going to get this put back into position. So it's the right hand side of the belt that we need to make sure is taut, as this is what dictates the timing between the crank and the cam. So we need to make sure that that side of the belt is solid. Sometimes what you have to do to manage to get the belt back into position in the correct timing, or the correct position between the cam and the crank, is to turn the crank a fraction anti-clockwise, just enough to get the belt on, and then obviously as soon as you turn it clockwise again, it's back into exact time. So now with a 6mm hex in the timing belt tensioner, we need to turn it clockwise, and we're tensioning it to in between those two metal locating pegs, which is the correct position for a country that averages 20 degrees Celsius. So in a cold country it would be more to the left, and in a very hot country it would be over to the right. So we want it somewhere in the middle, and then at the same time as it's held in position, we need to tighten the bolt below on the tensioner. But like I've already said, please check out the timing belt video for a step-by-step of removal and refitting of the timing belt. I'm just going through this quickly as we're doing the other jobs. So I've tightened the bolt with a spanner while holding the tensioner in position with the 6mm hex. Remove the cam locking pin. You may need to wiggle the cam sprocket in order to get it out, because it'll be pinched on it. So check the timing marks again. And what we now need to do is rotate the crank twice and check the marks once again. So turning it over clockwise. So as you can see, span it round twice, and both the timing marks on the crank and the cam line up. So the belt is fitted correctly and the engine is timed. Refit the vacuum pump and the fuse box. So just need to get the nut off the crank pulley, and then we're going to fit the harmonic dampener and torque the crank pulley nut down to 300. Once again, make sure the mating surfaces are clean. To tighten the crank pulley down properly using a torque wrench, you'll need this locking tool. Alternatively, you can have someone put the car in gear and press the feet on the brakes while you tighten the nut, but I don't particularly recommend doing that because I think it puts unnecessary pressure on the belt. Ideally, just get a locking tool, or if you must, just use a windy gun on the nut, providing you can be certain that it will meet or exceed the 300 Newton meter requirement. Now, if you're wondering what 300 Newton meters is like to tighten down, especially when you haven't got much access room, it is very, very difficult. There we go. The torque for the bolts is 35 Newton meters plus 50 degrees. So I'm just going to tighten them up carefully with the windy gun. Spin the crank round with a socket to get to the last bolt. Refit the auxiliary belt. This time I've made it a bit easier for myself by sticking the T60 Torx bit onto an adapter for the breaker bar. Should make it just so much easier to get the belt slack. Just make sure that it's definitely in line with every groove pulley. We don't want it to jump off. I haven't replaced the timing belt cover yet. I'm just going to reconnect the battery and run the engine. I might just do another 2 revolutions and check the timing one last time before starting the car. I have now reconnected the battery. I'm just going through my mind, thinking about every bolt and every procedure that I've done. I just want to know in my head for sure that I've tightened everything. I'm checking my box where I've put all my fixings and making sure that I haven't left anything. I had actually forgotten to put this bottom cover on the timing belt, just these 2 10mm bolts there. So I've done that and I'm ready to start the car. killed it. That's job complete. So I'm really glad to have got this done, and the engine is still running. I haven't broke it yet. Obviously you'll need to box everything else back up, cover up the ECU, timing belt cover, but I've got the next job to get on to. I'm going to be replacing the 5-speed gearbox with a 6-speed gearbox whilst doing the crank seal on the other side. So I really do hope that this video has helped if you have watched it all the way through. I know that I could do a better job of the video. Not everything will be correct or perfect, but I'm still glad to be able to help the amount of people that I can. So thanks for watching, and I hope you'll stick around for the next ones.